Great. Thank you all for coming. My name is Jeremy Asa. I'm the Wildlands and Water Program Director with Central Oregon LandWatch. We're an environmental land use watchdog for our region, and our mission is to protect and defend Central Oregon's livable future for future generations to come. Our work covers Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook counties, and these are the ancestral and traditional ceded lands of the Wasco, Warm Springs, and Paiute tribes. And we've been doing this work since 1986, and our small but mighty team of 12 spends our days working to make sure what we love about Central Oregon today remains in place for the next 20, 50, or 100 years down the road. And before we dive into tonight's presentation, I wanted to highlight a few events coming up here in Central Oregon in September and October. On September 20th, we'll kick off a 1 week only sustaining member drive. I just got a sneak peek at some of the swag that we'll be offering. It's pretty sweet, so I highly recommend you check this out. On September 24th, we'll be at Bend Together, an afternoon event for Bend Central District changemakers to meet and connect. And on October 3rd, we'll kick off our new Livable Future Forum with an event sure to be of interest to the folks tuning in here tonight. It'll be titled A Mule Deer's Life, and I'll be talking with John Nelson, the curator of wildlife at the High Desert Museum, about Central Oregon's most beloved ungulate and all the ways we can help the species thrive. We got a lot more going on, so please check our website and our social channels to see all the upcoming events. And of course, tonight we're extremely fortunate to have environmental journalist and author Ben Goldfarb here with us tonight to share from his latest book, Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. This book was named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times, the New Yorker, Smithsonian, and others. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I highly recommend you do. It paints a really potent picture of the consequences of building some 40 million miles of roads across our planet and the complex problems we face as society and figuring out how to reconcile our reliance on vehicles with the impacts they're having on our natural environment. And here in Central Oregon, from encouraging sprawl to fragmenting our forest and wildlands, road systems are impacting nearly all aspects of LandWatch's work. And one particularly challenging impact of roads is the barrier they present to the movement of wildlife. But there is hope. And before we dive into Ben's presentation, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the work LandWatch is doing here in Central Oregon in this space. For the past 2 years, LandWatch has helped convene and manage the Bend to Suttle Lake Wildlife Passage Initiative, a coalition with representatives from 18 different partner groups, including state and federal agencies, tribes, nonprofits, landowners, and educational institutions. And our broad partnership has come together around the shared goal of improving motorist and wildlife safety along the 35 miles of Highway 20 between Bend and Suttle Lake. And we aim to do that by building wildlife crossings. And many people don't realize that this section of Highway 20 right here in our backyard sees the highest density of deer and elk wildlife vehicle collisions in the entire state of Oregon, with some 350 to 600 mule deer and elk killed every year by cars driving on that road. And that poses both a serious risk to wildlife, but also to the safety of our community. And I'm curious, so we're going to put up a poll here. How many people tuning in tonight have hidden animal while driving? So this will pop up on your screens here shortly. And go ahead and fill it out. I'll give you about 15 more seconds to do so, and then we'll close that poll. But curious to see how many folks may have had an incident with wildlife. Okay, about 5 seconds and we'll close. All right, let's close that poll and display the results. Wow, yeah, so about 20% of the folks tuning in tonight have hit wildlife, and another half almost. So it's a very common occurrence, unfortunately, for folks living in Central Oregon and elsewhere across the state in the West. And in Ben's book, he talks a lot about the impact of roads like Highway 20 have had. And one of the things I found really remarkable, and this is a direct quote from the book, cars have made deer North America's most dangerous wild animal, implicated in 3 times more deaths than wasps and bees, 40 times more than snakes, and 400 times more than sharks. And while we're able to mitigate the impacts of some parts of roads, while mitigating the impacts of roads can be hard, there are some solutions that have been proven to be highly effective, including wildlife crossings. And in Oregon and across the West, wildlife crossings have proven to be up to 90% effective at reducing wildlife vehicle collisions. Unfortunately for us in Oregon, as a state, we really lagged far behind the other states across the West in developing and implementing dedicated wildlife crossing structures to address the problem. But we're starting to make some progress. In 2019, the Oregon legislature passed House Bill 2834, which directed the Oregon Department of Transportation and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife to coordinate efforts to reduce wildlife collisions in the state. And since that bill's passage, the legislature has allocated $12 million to support wildlife crossing initiatives across the state. And while that might sound like a lot, it's really just a drop in the bucket relative to the overall need. And so right now, LandWatch and conservation partners are working to secure a permanent state funding mechanism and looking at the 2025 legislature to do that. And so stay tuned for opportunities to engage at coming January, when the start of the 2025 legislative session here in Oregon kicks off. In addition to the progress at the state level, at the federal level, the U.S. Congress recently allocated unprecedented grant opportunities to address wildlife passage concerns, including about 12 different federal grants that sum up to be billions of dollars that could support wildlife crossing initiatives. One of those is a dedicated fund with $350 million of competitive grants and a program called the Wildlife Crossing Pilot Program, something a lot of partners and conservation interests are working to make a permanent program at the federal level. And I share all this because it's really an exciting time to be working on wildlife crossings. The recent progress at the state and federal level provides a once-in-a-generation opportunity to secure the funding needed to plan, design, and implement projects like the Ben to Suttle Lake Wildlife Passage Initiative. And locally, we've been making some great progress to that end. In July of this year, the Ben to Suttle Lake Coalition completed a corridor study and identified a total of 11 potential locations between Bend and Suttle Lake where a wildlife crossing could be built. Of those 11 locations, the partners selected 4 sites, all within 5 miles of each other at the base of Black Butte, to move forward towards construction. And we're now working to fundraise the non-federal match required to apply for some of the federal funding I mentioned earlier, which will ultimately provide the majority of the funding required to make this project a reality here in Central Oregon. And so if you're interested in this type of work and learning more about road ecology, you've really tuned into the right spot. If you haven't had a chance to read Ben's book, again, I highly recommend you do. And tonight we'll be giving away a free copy to one lucky attendee who stumps us or comes up with the most surprising or delightful question. So be thinking hard. This is a fact-based exercise. It's not arbitrary. Be thinking about your questions, putting them in the chat, or saving them till the end. We'll have about 15 minutes for question and answer. With that, Ben, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you, Jeremy, so much for that introduction, and thanks for talking about all of the really wonderful and important work that you guys are doing in Central Oregon. I really appreciate it on behalf of lots of folks who work in the field of road ecology. It's just exciting to see how rapidly this cause of wildlife crossings is growing, and it's just wonderful to be speaking with a group that's doing so much to advance that cause. So this conversation tonight and the book that it's kind of based off of is about road ecology. And, that's a term that is maybe familiar to some of you. Road ecology is basically this relatively small but kind of fast-growing field of science that essentially looks at all of the different ways that roads and nature interact, and all of the different ways that roads transform nature, and importantly, what we can do about the harms that roads inflict upon our ecosystems and wildlife. And roads are so transformative to nature in large part because there are just so many of them, right? We have something like 4 million miles of road here in the US. That's the planet's largest road network. There are around 40 million miles of road around the world. And there's something like 15 million miles more of paved road alone that are essentially being built and that will exist by the middle of the 21st century. We're in this period that scientists have called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that's sweeping the planet. So there are a lot of roads out there already. There are many more that are being built. And I think in part because roads are so ubiquitous, we tend not to think about them very much, right? We use them every single day to go to schools and hospitals and grocery stores. Roads are fundamentally useful in many ways. And of course, they have this powerful cultural significance as well. There are these symbols of human freedom and mobility and momentum that, Jack Kerouac wrote about and Bruce Springsteen sang about. They're how we get around the landscape and the continent. And that's somewhat ironic because for all of the mobility and freedom and momentum that they're providing for us, they're denying animals that same mobility and momentum and freedom. They're curtailing animal movements and journeys on a truly almost incomprehensible scale. And the way they do that primarily, or at least most conspicuously, is through roadkill, right? By killing animals directly. It's again almost impossible to comprehend just how many animals are killed by cars around the world. There are more than 1 million vertebrate animals killed every day in the United States. And again, that's to say nothing of butterflies and spiders and other invertebrates. Earlier you guys did that poll where something like 20% of respondents said that they hit an animal, and I would wager that the real figure is probably 100%. We've all at some point killed a bird or a rodent or a snake, potentially without realizing it. 20% of us maybe hit a large conspicuous animal, but we're all unfortunately killing wildlife driving around out there. I think in part because logically enough, most of the animals that get hit by cars are relatively common animals like raccoons and gray squirrels and white-tailed deer in much of the continent. We tend not to think about roadkill as truly a conservation crisis, right? Okay, lots of squirrels are getting hit, but there are a lot of squirrels out there, right? They can probably handle it. But in fact, there are dozens of threatened and endangered species for which road mortality is the primary source of mortality. We know that we're in the middle of this 6th mass extinction event in our planet's history, and roads are truly an existential threat to many of our federally listed species. And in fact, as Richard Foreman, kind of the godfather of road ecology, has noted, roadkill is today the leading direct human cause of vertebrate mortality on land, right? Which is just a fancy way of saying that there is literally nothing that we do to kill more wild animals than drive, right? It's truly an ecological crisis. And I think that one of the reasons that roads are so pernicious is that they have this way of kind of subverting evolution. You think about the defense mechanisms of so many of our most beloved species, from porcupines who bristle their quills to skunks that spray to turtles who withdraw into their shells, right? These are kind of stand your ground mechanisms that worked really well for thousands of generations against mountain lions and wolves and hawks and other natural predators. But when your predator is an F-150, barreling down I-90 at 80 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is hunker down and stand your ground, right? So in that sense, traffic and the automobile, I think, has taken evolutionary history and rendered it not only moot, but actually maladaptive. And I think that's kind of tragic to contemplate. So roadkill, these direct collisions between humans and animals, or cars and animals, are the most conspicuous and obvious ways that roads and nature interact. But they're really just the tip of the iceberg. And road ecology, this field of science that I write about in this book, is really dedicated to unraveling all of those different manifold connections. Roads are vectors of invasive species, right? So many plants and animals have basically entered ecosystems along a grid. Here's one example of that. This is a national forest that I visited in Montana, where for many decades, logging trucks had transported the seeds of this invasive thistle in their tires and the tire treads. And then, all of those thistles basically bloomed at once. Now there's this eerie linear stripe across the landscape that follows the bed of that old logging road. So roads transform ecosystems by introducing non-native species. There are also these zones of erosion. You know, as many of you probably know, the single largest road manager on Earth is the U.S. Forest Service. You could go to the moon and most of the way back on old logging roads, and you know, most of those roads are dirt rather than paved. And they don't really receive a whole lot of traffic, so they're not a roadkill issue necessarily. But you know, you get a big rainstorm or snow melt event, and those old dirt logging roads basically turn liquid and just hemorrhage sediment into fish-bearing streams and smother amphibian larvae and so on, right? So roads are actually these hydrological and even geological forces at times. Roads are sources of pollution. You know, our cars are constantly bleeding cadmium and copper and zinc and microplastics and all kinds of stuff into the environment. You know, a few years ago, scientists at the University of Washington basically identified a chemical in tire particles as being responsible for coho salmon die-offs. You know, chemical that nobody had ever heard of before, basically. And, you know, certainly that's happening in Oregon as well, right? So we're learning more about this kind of chemical connection between roads and nature all the time. One of those really significant chemical connections, I think, is road salt. You know, we apply 20 million tons of road salt as a de-icing agent in the U.S. every year, and that salt runs off into rivers and lakes and streams, and you know, turns fresh water increasingly brackish. It also creates this ecological trap by luring animals to the roadside. You know, we basically turned our highways into these linear salt licks for you know, for ungulates and other species, and thus created very dangerous potential roadkill situations. I will say that you know, that road salt connection inspired my favorite road sign. This is in Jasper National Park in Canada. Every winter you can see signs that say, "Do not let moose lick your car." I'm not sure you could stop a moose from licking your car, but you know, you sort of appreciate the idea. And you know, clearly that road salt issue is a pretty significant one. Roads are also these hellscapes of noise, right? You know, a road itself might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet that noise pollution from engines and tires is billowing into the ecosystem, you know, potentially for half a mile on either side of the highway. And that's a profound form of habitat loss. You know, think about being a Western meadowlark who has to sing to attract a mate. Well, if your potential mate can't hear you over the noise of traffic, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? So road noise is driving animals away from places they might otherwise live, and you know, really contributing to this habitat loss crisis we have on our hands. I'll add too that you know, road noise is a really significant public health problem. You know, road noise elevates our blood pressures and cortisol levels, and risks of diabetes and cardiac disease and stroke and all kinds of maladies. So it's really one of the great, I think, unsung ecological and public health crises of our time. I just wanted to, hopefully this will work. I just wanted to play a quick video that I think illustrates this concept of road noise as habitat loss, because it's not necessarily an intuitive one. But here's a little video. This is from British Columbia, I believe. You can see a couple of brown bears wandering happily through the forest. As soon as that ATV engine noise shows up, right, those bears go into high alert and then scatter, right? So that's traffic noise or vehicle noise driving animals away from a place they'd like to live. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? Yes, roads are destroying ecosystems, but they're also, in a sense, creating novel ecosystems. Animals are endlessly creative and flexible and adaptive. They have all kinds of clever ways of taking advantage of the you know, the ecosystems we create with our infrastructure. And working on this book, I visited Minnesota, where I went to a highway overpass, and on the underside of the overpass were all of these crevices, you know, the kind of the joints, and there were hundreds of little brown bats roosting in those crevices, taking advantage of that novel concrete habitat. Another example of roads as habitat are roadsides, right? You know, imagine being a monarch butterfly migrating through the Midwest, crossing over Illinois and Iowa and Kansas, these states that are just monocultures of corn and soy and grass. Well, those roadsides are the largest forms of public land in many Midwestern states. They're the last remnant strips of prairie along our highways. And it's not coincidence that, the monarch butterfly migration basically follows I-35 today from Minnesota to Texas, right? So again, roads are creating habitat even as they're destroying it, but it's also very dangerous habitat. We're luring these butterflies and all kinds of pollinating insects to these roadsides, and in many cases, killing them. Millions of monarch butterflies are killed during their migration by cars every year. We don't think about insects as being roadkill, but certainly it's a huge impact. So we always have to be conscious. Yes, we're providing habitat in the form of our infrastructure to wildlife, but are we potentially creating an ecological trap? Another way in which that might manifest is with scavengers. We've turned our highways into these linear carrion trails, and ravens and magpies and bald eagles and golden eagles all find sustenance, scavenging on those deer and elk. We've all seen this, right? The bird foraging along the roadside. And certainly that's a potential resource. But again, it's a dangerous resource. If you're a bald eagle with a belly full of venison, it's hard to achieve liftoff, and you run the risk of being hit by a car yourself. So again, that danger of creating an ecological trap is always present. So of course, we know that these collisions between cars and animals are really significant losses to biodiversity. And they're also really dangerous events for us drivers as well. As Jeremy said in his introduction, deer are the most dangerous wild animal in North America. Obviously, it's not the deer's fault, right? It's the car's fault. But I think it attests to just how frequent and how perilous wildlife vehicle collisions really are. And here are just a few kind of incredible deer vehicle collision or DVC statistics that I think illustrate this point. There are up to 2 million deer collisions annually in the US. That's something like a deer collision every 30 seconds. So there'll be, theoretically many deer collisions while we're having this conversation. The average deer collision costs more than $9,000 in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and insurance costs and the rest of it. So these are very expensive events, as well as dangerous events that collectively cost the United States more than $8 billion every year. And again, there are also really significant dangers to drivers. There are up to 400 drivers killed in deer collisions every year, and that's likely a really dramatic underestimate. I've talked to many state troopers who've told me that they think that lots of single car fatal crashes are wildlife crashes, right? Where somebody swerves to avoid a deer or an elk and hits a tree or a telephone pole. And, unfortunately, nobody lives to tell the story, but likely that was a wildlife related crash that just doesn't get recorded as such. And of course, deer aren't the only, large, dangerous ungulate out there. The average elk collision costs more than $20,000. The average moose collision costs more than $40,000, right? So, again, just to reiterate, these are really dangerous, expensive, problematic events for both drivers and wildlife. And I'll point out too that from the animalist perspective, that the animal vehicle collision, this moment of impact, is really only half the problem that traffic creates for wildlife. And in some ways, an even more significant problem is the barrier to animal movement and migration that roads create, right? On many of our highways, we have these kind of constant flows of traffic that make it really difficult for animals to cross highways altogether, even if they don't get hit by cars. So here's just one video illustrating this point. It's a little bit stressful, but I'll just tell you now that no animal gets hit in this video. But it does illustrate how hard it is for animals to cross these highways. So this is in Wyoming, right? And this is not, a big interstate highway. This is just a rural 2-lane highway, in the evening. And you can see that flow of traffic is basically still too constant for animals to safely cross that highway. And as you might imagine, many animals basically give up trying to cross and return from whence they came and don't make it across the road at all. And in fact, road ecologists have observed that any road with more than 10,000 vehicles a day is basically an absolute barrier to most wildlife. And that's basically any federal highway in the U.S. Is functionally a barrier. And in some cases, that barrier effect, that wall of traffic or moving fence, as some biologists call it, is almost more problematic than roadkill itself. And to illustrate that, one of the places I went working on this book was the Red Desert in southwestern Wyoming, where there's this kind of famous herd of mule deer, who migrates from their summer range to their winter range around 300 miles round trip, so a pretty significant movement. And of course, mule deer are doing this in Oregon as well at slightly shorter scales, probably. And scientists have had satellite collars on these deer for a long time, so they have a good sense of where they go and where they hang out and how they move through the landscape. And what they found is that I-80, that big interstate highway that runs through Oregon or through Wyoming rather, is effectively an absolute barrier to deer movement, right? And you can see this in this image where these purple blobs are basically the places where the deer hang out in the winter. And there are no purple blobs south of I-80, that interstate highway. And in winter, those deer basically pool up on the north side of that highway looking for a way through traffic and are unable to find one because, again, that wall of vehicles is so constant that they can't cross at all. And as a result, they can't reach the entirety of their winter range and the food they need to survive. And in some especially harsh winters, 40% of that deer herd will actually starve. And again, that's a bigger problem, I think, than roadkill itself, potentially at least. A herd of 1,000 mule deer can handle a few collisions on the highway. What they can't handle is losing access to all of that prime winter range, right? That habitat loss that's so catastrophic. Here's another map that illustrates a similar point. These are the movements of a single young male grizzly bear in Montana. The white line here is I-90. And every red X is a place where that bear approached the highway and bounced off like a ping pong ball, just repelled by that wall of traffic. So that bear tried to cross the highway more than 40 times before he finally found a way across, on the far west side of the screen here, right? So again, a road is, it's 150 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, but it's having these habitat impacts that can span hundreds of thousands of acres. Here's another depressing map. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California, a very famous population of mountain lions just west of Los Angeles in the Santa Monica Mountains. Every cluster of multicolored dots is a different individual mountain lion. And the red lines are freeways, some of the busiest freeways on Earth, the 101 and the 405. And you can see that those mountain lions effectively never cross those freeways. And as a result, the young male mountain lions can't disperse out of that population, so they're often killed by dominant males. And even more problematically, no new mountain lions can disperse into the population, right? So there are no new cats freshening up that gene pool. And as a result, those mountain lions are stuck mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters. And they've begun to suffer genetic defects as a result of all of that inbreeding. And they've entered what scientists have called an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral that's going to wipe them out if nothing is done to help them. But fortunately, something is being done to help them, and that's in the form of wildlife crossings, right? Wildlife crossings are really the best tool we have at our disposal to solve these two linked, related problems, right? We've got these wildlife vehicle collisions, all of these fatalities that are so dangerous, both for animals and for drivers. And we have this barrier effect, right? This fragmentation that highways create. And wildlife crossings basically address both of those issues by allowing animals to safely move back and forth across the landscape. This is a wildlife overpass on Highway 93 in Montana, just north of Missoula on Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribal land, very famous project. So wildlife crossings, the idea of building overpasses and underpasses and tunnels and culverts, all of these different structures that let animals move back and forth. This idea really began in Europe in the 1950s. France built the first wildlife crossings, followed by Germany and Switzerland and Austria, other Western European countries. Today, the Netherlands is really the world's leader in this concept. The Dutch, of course, are famously great engineers, and they've got a higher density of wildlife crossings than any other country. This is a famous Dutch overpass that crosses two highways, a railroad track, a sports complex, and a business park. A pretty cool project. So that's the sort of thing that is theoretically possible, right? The place that wildlife crossings became famous and renowned was in Banff National Park in Canada, which, like many protected areas, has a highway, the Trans-Canada Highway, running right through the middle of it. That was historically a big problem, as you might imagine, for all kinds of wildlife. So in the 1980s, Parks Canada began building wildlife crossings, underpasses, primarily for deer and elk and other large mammals. And in the 1990s, they began adding overpasses, and the overpasses were primarily for grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are these big, powerful animals who don't want to slink through a culvert. They want to be up on the deck of a bridge where they can kind of confront their potential enemies head on. So there are species that really requires overpasses, so Parks Canada built about a half dozen of these overpasses for grizzly bears. The bears use them. The sows taught their cubs to use them. The cubs taught their cubs. There's kind of this cool intergenerational learning process that happened in Banff National Park that healed those genetic divides as those animals moved back and forth and bred on either side of the highway. And so that those Banff crossings, I think proved very, very definitively that this technology, this concept is effective. The first wildlife crossings in the U.S. Were built mostly in the Mountain West, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. And the reason for that is that, those Western states have these big migratory ungulate herds, right? Mule deer, pronghorn, elk, who move back and forth across the landscape along relatively predictable travel routes. And so if you've got, 1,000 mule deer crossing the same highway in Wyoming every single year, there's this big pile of carcasses, right, saying, hey, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? So those migratory ungulate herds are generally pretty easy animals to mitigate for, which is why those mountain states did them first. I think one of the really important lessons that that road ecologists learned quickly is the importance of fencing, right? People always say, well, how do the animals know to use the wildlife crossings? And the answer is basically the fences guide them there, right? That deer, is looking for a place to cross the highway, hits the fence line, paces it for a half mile in either direction, finds that underpass, and then walks through, right? So those two elements, the fences and the crossings, really have to work hand in hand. The fences keep the animals off the highway, and the crossings allow them to move back and forth safely. And then the other important piece too are the jump outs, right? These one-way escape ramps that you've probably seen around Oregon and maybe wondered about what the heck are those things. And that's basically, if a deer or an elk does get through the fence somehow and is trapped in that road corridor, he can find that one-way exit ramp and get out of there. So those jump outs are another really important piece of this whole kind of infrastructural complex that that keeps animals safe. So today, we know very definitively that wildlife crossings are effective. They're typically reducing wildlife vehicle collisions by more than 90% where they're implemented. We know they allow these migrations to continue. But the objection that you still hear commonly is, well, wait a second, aren't they pretty expensive? The average overpass today is going to cost, probably $8 to $10 million. The average underpass is going, for $500,000 to $1 million, right? So there's a little bit of sticker shock there. But I think the really important thing to remember is that because these crossings are preventing so many of these dangerous, expensive, wildlife vehicle collisions, they're generally paying for themselves very quickly, right? Again, we know the average deer collision costs close to $10,000. The average elk collision costs $20,000. So if you can prevent, a couple dozen of these collisions every year, as so many wildlife crossings do, you can recoup those construction costs really quickly. And here's, one example of that. This is an overpass for pronghorn in Wyoming that, cost a few $1,000,000 when it was proposed. The Department of Transportation, the State Department of Transportation, and various politicians were kind of up in arms. We're really going to spend millions of dollars helping antelope cross a highway. Really, that seems kind of frivolous. But this structure had paid for its own costs in under 5 years after its completion, right? So again, whether you're concerned about conservation or driver safety or fiscal conservatism, there's a good reason to build these things. Of course, there's a caveat to that, which is that here in the U.S. we've tended to build wildlife crossings primarily for those large common ungulates that mess your car up when you hit them, right? Which it makes sense, it's understandable, but it means that lots of species have gotten left out in the cold. Nobody's ever totaled their car hitting a northern red-legged frog, so ODOT is not likely to mitigate for them. But we know that reptiles and amphibians in particular, some of the most road endangered species on Earth. The amphibians especially are, migrating between their upland forest habitat and their wetland breeding habitat, and typically there are roads between those two habitats, and they're just getting absolutely slaughtered. And so I think in some ways, yes, let's build lots more passages for deer and elk and antelope, but let's also start building them for those smaller, rare and threatened species that aren't necessarily driver safety risks, but are certainly a great conservation risk from roadways. And I'll point out that I think there are other countries out there that think more about this stuff than we do, right? This is a wildlife overpass for red crab. This is on Christmas Island, where crabs migrate in the millions from their rainforest spawning habitat to their rainforest kind of upland habitat to their beachfront spawning habitat, and they cross roads, and there are all of these incredible overpasses for crab usage, right? Which is pretty cool to contemplate, and certainly not something that we've done in the U.S. for some of those smaller critters. There are also lots of countries like Australia and Brazil and Costa Rica who have built lots of canopy crossings for arboreal animals that have to move back and forth between forest patches that are fragmented by roads and aren't going to descend to the forest floor to use a traditional underpass. And it's a cool concept. And look, here in the US, we have lots of arboreal animals too. We've got porcupines and martens and flying squirrels and all kinds of critters that would benefit from canopy crossings, but we haven't done this sort of thing because, again, I think we take this very driver safety focused approach rather than a conservation focused approach, at least in many cases. And look, we certainly need a whole lot more of these wildlife crossings in many more places, and that's happening now. Maybe not as quickly as it could or should, but it's going on. I mentioned earlier those mountain lions in Southern California who are fragmented by the 101, that giant freeway, and are in the extinction vortex caused by inbreeding. Well, as you probably know, there's a giant overpass, the Liberty Canyon overpass, which will be the largest wildlife crossing in the U.S. That's being built for those mountain lions right now, and will be finished at the end of next year or the beginning of 2026, right? So we're starting to expand our concept of where we can apply this sort of technology. If you can build a wildlife overpass over a 10-lane highway with 300,000 cars a day, you can build one literally anywhere, right? And as Jeremy mentioned at the start of this conversation, we're in this pretty exciting period in the history of wildlife mitigation. As Jeremy said, in 2021, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act included this $350 million grant program to fund new wildlife crossings. And many states, including Oregon, are tapping into that funding for new projects now, which is really exciting. It's the largest single pot of funding that's ever been allocated for wildlife-friendly infrastructure, so that's good. At the same time, that same Infrastructure Act had $110 billion for highway expansions and upgrades. And so, in some sense, we're making the problem worse, even as we're attempting to solve it in some places. And so, we're again, we're at this challenging period where we're thinking more about this issue than ever before, and yet the scale and the scope of the need remains much larger than the resources we're allocating for it. And I'll point out too, of course, that we've been talking a lot about large mammals, but fish are also in dire need of safe passage. Especially in Oregon and other sort of coastal states with anadromous fish runs, salmon especially. Every place that a stream crosses a road, that stream is generally going through a narrow little culvert. One of those corrugated metal pipes that's basically creating a barrier to the migration of fish. And there's also $1 billion in the Infrastructure Act for new culverts, these bigger box culverts, basically, in many cases, with natural stream bed bottoms rather than metal or concrete bottoms that allow fish to basically seamlessly move under roadways. And this is a one of those projects in Washington outside of Olympia. And here's the chum salmon in the bottom left corner of the screen preparing to use that big new culvert, which was built for its usage. So again, we're thinking about the large mammals. That's great, but especially in a place like Oregon, where those anadromous fish are so critical to the economy and to ecosystems and to culture. Providing passage for fish is really, really vital. And I'll point out too, of course, that good culverts are good fish passage, yes, but they're also potential wildlife passage. There's something like 2,000 dedicated wildlife crossings in the US and around 2 million culverts. And animals are really good at finding and using those culverts. And here's just one quick example of that. This is a famous video that was shot in California of a coyote and a badger cooperatively hunting using that culvert to move across the landscape. So it's just one of the cool ecological interactions that that culverts facilitate. And I think there's a cool opportunity to make those culverts good wildlife passage. This is what's known as a critter shelf. This is in Montana, where basically there are these culverts that get seasonally flooded. Or these partially flooded, and so they build these little critter shelves so that bobcats and weasels and other animals can walk back and forth through those culverts without getting their paws wet, because they don't want to walk through the water there, right? So not every wildlife crossing project has to be a $10 million giant overpass. There's a lot we can do with the infrastructure already on the landscape through cheap tweaks and retrofits to make it more suitable for wildlife. So ultimately, the task before us and the opportunity before us is to remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity, right? No pressure. We said at the start of this that there's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive, right? We know we're in the middle of this biodiversity crisis and sixth mass extinction event, and roads are an enormous part of that. So if we're going to save wildlife on this planet, it starts with thinking about our roadways in a new way. And here's just one example of that. This is a wildlife underpass for ocelots in Texas, and South Texas is home to the US's final ocelots, around 100 of them. And car collisions are 40% of ocelot mortality, right? So that's a species that we are going to lose in our lifetime if we don't figure out a way to help them safely cross roads. So with that, I'll say thank you all so much. As Jeremy mentioned, I do have this book out, which came out about a year ago, if this conversation only whet your appetite for more juicy road ecology content, I'll mention that this week is the paperback just came out, which is exciting. So if a $30 hardcover was too much for you, now there's a floppier, cheaper version. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal both loved it, among other outlets. So there's liberals and conservatives coming together around the niche cause of wildlife passage. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but it really is true. I mean, there's no environmental issue out there, I think, that unites as many disparate factions as wildlife crossings. I can't think of another issue that both the Humane Society and the hunting lobby can agree upon. So in this hyper-polarized world, wildlife passage is a really a unifying concept. And I'm so glad that Central Oregon LandWatch and so many other groups are starting to think about it and do something about it. So with that, I'll say thank you all so much. And I think we have a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Great. Thank you, Ben. That was a terrific presentation. And yeah, I really hope it did whet your guys' appetite. The book is a terrific read and really goes into a lot more detail. So thanks for sharing that with us here tonight, Ben. We have had a couple questions come in to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'd welcome more. So if folks have different or additional questions, please add it in. Remember, the best or most the question that stumps us or that we like the most will get a free copy of Ben's book. So maybe that's incentive to put a couple more into the Q&A. The first question came from Melanie. Says, thinking about the 15 million new roads coming, what opportunities are there to make the roads more wildlife friendly? It would seem more effective to include crossings in the initial design in addition to retrofitting existing roads.
Yeah, that's such a great point by Melody, and certainly that is happening in some countries, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges that we face is that we built our interstate highway system in the middle of the 20th century before we really understood just how harmful roads are for wildlife. So at least in theory, a lot of the countries that are building their infrastructure out from scratch right now as part of that infrastructure tsunami can do it right the first time in a way that we fail to. And a lot of those countries do have some pretty progressive laws and policies. Nepal, for example, has a law basically requiring wildlife crossings with any new road through a forested area, right? Which is certainly something that we don't have in the U.S. Or India, another great example. A place that in some places is actually elevating their highways on concrete pillars so that tigers and elephants and other animals can walk back and forth safely. Myanmar is doing a lot of really cool wildlife crossing and habitat mapping work, right? So a lot of these countries are doing what Melanie suggests, kind of getting it right the first time. The problem again is that the pace and the scale of highway construction is just so rapid and vast that even wildlife crossings can't totally keep up with it.
And I might just add a little from working in Oregon that there is a lot of opportunity at the state legislature to put new policy in place that requires the Department of Transportation to consider wildlife crossings as they're moving forward with new construction, whether that's expansion like additional passing lanes or new roads. And so just a plug to be active in the state legislature where a lot of these policies are put in place, and we really can make a difference in shaping the culture and direction of our state transportation. Another question from Pamela says, thanks for your environmental investigative journalism, Ben, from beavers to road ecology. Can't wait to see what's next. Interested in follow-up monitoring of how the animals sense and use these new human-engineered passages. Remembers the amazing video you showed of a coyote and badger using a tunnel together in Santa Cruz. And question, have you seen other footage like this of wildlife meetups as they utilize these new safe connectors?
That's a good question. I don't know about interspecies meetups like that, but I mean I'll say that certainly the learning curve for figuring out where these crossings are and getting comfortable using them, it really it varies from species to species. I mean, coyotes are obviously, that's like every time a wildlife crossing gets built, usually the biologists and engineers involved will have kind of like an informal side bet about, who's the first animal to use this thing going to be, and it's always a coyote, right? Because they're just, such bold, smart generalists who, figure these things out pretty quickly. With deer, it's a little bit slower. There's a good study in Wyoming that basically found the first year that a wildlife underpass was built, 50% of the deer herd used it. The next year it was 75%, and by the third year it was 95% of that herd was going through that underpass, right? So there's a little bit of time and learning that has to happen as again those does go through and their fawns follow, and their fawns get comfortable and become parents themselves and teach their fawns. And then there are species, those really kind of big, wary carnivores, those grizzly bears, especially, which can take years. Those Banff wildlife crossings I mentioned. I mean, those are basically deemed failures after 5 years because grizzly bears just weren't using them. In reality, the bears were just taking a while to acclimate, and now they go back and forth readily. So, I know I'm not totally addressing the question, but it's interesting to think about that kind of knowledge transmission and acclimation process that happens with wildlife crossings that can really differ wildly among species. The other cool thing I'll mention that also happens that you see at many wildlife crossings is that over time you get herds of ungulates moving through those crossings, and all of those hooves are creating game trails, right? And those game trails basically create almost like an external memory that other animals follow to wildlife crossings. And one bird ecologist told me that it's almost like the entire landscape learns together, how to use these things, which I think is a pretty cool concept to think about, is the way that these crossings actually, they not only get used by animals, they actually guide the movements of animals, and that changes the physical landscape in some sense.
Thanks, Ben. Another question here from Richard. Border walls in Texas are likely a sure thing. What can be done to allow wildlife to cross without allowing immigrants to also cross? If illegal immigrants can use these wildlife crossings, the border patrols will never let wildlife crossings to be built.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, so in some places the border wall has been built with what they call wildlife crossings, wildlife passages, which they're not like they're not like road crossings. They're basically they're basically little cutouts in the wall, and those they're typically like 8.5 by 11, which is basically the size of a standard sheet of paper. So they do get used by smaller critters. I've seen videos of coatis going through, and raccoons and bobcats and smaller animals, but they're too small for for jaguars, right? The most kind of iconic, famous border crossing animal. And so I think there's I don't think there's really any way that a border wall is going to be anything other than a catastrophe for for habitat connectivity and wildlife in the Southwest.
Yeah. Another question here from Quinn. Such cool stuff. I grew up a few miles from I-80 in Pennsylvania. Do the roadkill numbers decrease on curvy exit ramps versus regular straight roads?
Huh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, you're right. You could imagine that right, people would slow down those exit ramps, and maybe do better at avoiding animals. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question. I mean, just because you grew up by I-80 in Pennsylvania, I mean, I'll say that there's a big section of this book that's about I-80 in Pennsylvania, because that was actually the site of some very important early roadkill studies, where basically when I-80 was first built, the roadkill rates in Pennsylvania were just catastrophic. I mean, many deer getting hit by cars every single day. And so biologists got called in to kind of figure out how to stop the problem or solve the problem. And as they were studying the problem, they basically discovered that deer were no longer being hit by cars. There was this huge surge of roadkill when the interstate first opened in Pennsylvania, and then the roadkill basically stopped. And the reason was that as the interstate became increasingly popular and well trafficked, that moving fence of vehicles was preventing deer from crossing highways altogether. So there's this really seminal series of research papers done in Pennsylvania on I-80 that basically figured out that you can imagine like there's this, sort of bell curve, right? Where, the more traffic you get, the more roadkill goes up. But then at a certain point, there's so much traffic that animals aren't even attempting to cross the road, and roadkill goes down again. And so, on many really busy interstates, you actually see almost no roadkill because, the traffic rates are just so dense that animals, aren't even venturing onto the asphalt. And I-80 in Pennsylvania, at least at one time in history, was an example of that.
And we had a comment come in that the Department of Transportation, DOTs, have a lot of guidance on stopping distance and road geometry, straight versus curved, hills versus valleys, and that where wildlife crossings go in, that can be a really important consideration when deciding where to end the directional fencing that Ben talked about in his presentation.
Yeah.
We had a question about getting in contact with you about some of your other work on beavers. I'll defer to you to put in the chat if you have a way to for folks to contact you.
Absolutely. I'll just pop my I'll just put my email address in there. I'm easy to find.
Great, thanks, Ben. And then from Quinn, there's always those odd follow up from the previous question. There's always those odd grass spaces between the ramp and the road, and I never see roadkill there. I spend too much time on the interstate. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, now I'm curious about the exit ramp phenomenon. I'm gonna email some road ecologists I know.
Well, great. That looks like all the questions we have in. I did ask the technical staff behind the scenes to select a winner, and Melanie's question around 15 miles of new roads and how do we address that was selected. So congratulations, Melanie. We'll be in touch following the presentation with a free copy of Ben's book. Anyways, just want to say thank you again, Ben, so much for both writing this book and putting the attention and spotlight on this. Really important, but also for tonight's terrific presentation. And thank you all for joining us here tonight. We hope to see you at an event in the near future.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Lace. Thanks to all of you for being here. Appreciate it.
Take care.